Picture this. It's May 1945. The war in Europe is over. A top German general, Alfred Jodl, is sitting in a stark interrogation room in Luxembourg, and an American officer is calmly telling him a story. A story so unbelievable, it completely shatters the general's understanding of his own defeat. He's learning that the massive Allied army group, the one his intelligence had been obsessed with for months, the one they were sure was about to strike at the heart of Europe, well, it never existed. It was all a ghost. And that feeling, that absolute shock, is captured perfectly by another German officer, Colonel Otto Hoffmann. Just listen to that quote. "Then we are not just defeated, we are fools." You can just feel the psychological gut punch. See, it wasn't just about losing on the battlefield. It was the crushing realization that their entire defensive strategy, all their planning, was built around a massive illusion crafted by the Allies. They'd been played.
So let's talk about the sheer scale of this con job, because it's staggering. At the most critical point of the war, right around D-Day, this phantom army successfully tied down roughly 200,000 of Germany's best troops. We're talking elite panzer divisions, just sitting there, waiting for an attack that was never coming. And the unit that pulled this off? Just a little over 1,100 guys. The numbers are just wild. It's maybe one of the greatest examples of leverage in military history. Which, of course, brings us to the big question, right? How? How on earth did this small, eclectic group of artists, sound engineers, and admin manage to pull off what is arguably the greatest magic trick in the history of warfare? This was no accident. It was a masterpiece of creativity, technology, and a deep, deep understanding of the human mind. Let's break it down. Okay, so first things first, the whole idea started with a fundamental shift in thinking. The Allies knew that winning this war wasn't just about tanks and planes. They had to get inside the enemy's head. They needed to win a battle of perception. This was going to be psychological warfare on a scale nobody had ever seen before. And the master plan for all of this had a code name: Operation Bodyguard. It was this huge, overarching strategy with one very specific goal: to convince the Germans of two things. First, that the main Allied invasion was absolutely going to happen at the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the English Channel. And second, that the eventual landings at Normandy, well, they were just a trick, a diversion. But here is where it gets really brilliant. The plan wasn't just a generic lie. It was a lie specifically tailored for an audience of one: Adolf Hitler. You see, Allied intelligence knew their target. They knew he was fixated on Pas-de-Calais. They knew he was convinced the Allies would take the most logical, direct route. And most importantly, they knew he had a massive confirmation bias. He loved any piece of intel that proved what he already thought was true. So the Allies didn't just throw lies at the Germans. They carefully crafted the exact lies Hitler was desperate to believe.
So you've got your plan. Now, how do you actually build a fake army? An army that looks, sounds, and even feels real to German reconnaissance planes and listening posts? Well, you hand the job over to people who create illusions for a living. You give it to artists, designers, and sound experts. And the tools they came up with were just incredible.
And this is the most famous tool in their arsenal. On the one hand, you have a real 32-ton Sherman tank. And on the other, you have its inflatable twin, weighing in at just 93 pounds. Seriously, 4 guys could pick one of these things up and move it into position. From a spy plane, flying a few thousand feet up, they looked absolutely identical. They even made fake tank tracks in the dirt. It didn't have to be perfect up close. It just had to fool a camera lens from the sky. And it did, beautifully.
This whole deception was really a full-blown theatrical production. It was built on 3 main pillars. First, the visual stuff, like those rubber tanks and dummy airplanes. Second was sonic warfare, making the Germans hear an army that wasn't there. And third, something called radio mimicry, which meant faking all the invisible radio chatter that an army constantly produces. You put all 3 together, and you have an illusion that's almost impossible to see through. Now, the sound part of this was just pure genius. I mean, we're not talking about just playing some tank noises on a big speaker. They worked with engineers from Bell Labs, the best in the business, to create these massive 500-pound speakers that could throw sound up to 15 miles away. They recorded everything: the specific sound of different tank engines, the clang of building a pontoon bridge, even just the random chatter of soldiers in a mess hall. They had sound engineers calculating how weather and terrain would affect the audio to make it even more realistic. It was literally a symphony of lies.
Okay, so you've got your inflatable props and your sound effects. That's a great start. But to really sell it, to make the enemy high command bet the farm on this illusion, you need a human touch. You need a trusted voice, someone on the inside, to confirm everything their spies are seeing and hearing. And this, my friends, is where the story goes from a clever military tactic to a flat-out espionage legend. This might be one of the most incredible intelligence achievements of the entire war. Think about this for a second. By 1944, British MI5, through a top-secret program called the double-cross system, had managed to do the unthinkable. They had found, captured, or turned every single German spy operating in Great Britain. Every one. The entire German intelligence network in Britain was now secretly working for the Allies. And the crown jewel of this whole operation was an agent named Juan Pujol Garcia. A Spanish national, the British called him Garbo because he was such a phenomenal actor. To the Germans, he was their top agent, a rebel. And Garbo, well, he didn't just send reports. He and his British handler built an entire fictional spy ring of 27 non-existent sub-agents, all feeding him information to make his intelligence seem unbelievably rich and detailed. The story of how he got started is it's perfect. He actually tried to volunteer for the British first, and they turned him down. So what does he do? He goes to the Germans, gets hired as a spy, moves to Lisbon, and just starts making stuff up about Britain using a tourist map and some train timetables. His fake reports were so good, they actually worried the British, who finally tracked him down and recruited him. And the punchline to this whole story? In July of 1944, months after D-Day, the Germans were so pleased with his intel about the Phantom Army that they awarded him the Iron Cross. He was decorated by the very people he was helping to defeat. You can't make this stuff up. So, we've seen the plan, the props, and the spies. But what does it all add up to? Did it actually make a difference? The answer is an absolute, resounding yes. The impact of this deception saved countless lives on D-Day, and its legacy, well, it's pretty surprising. This chart tells the whole story in just 2 bars. Look at this. The Germans had 18 of their best divisions dug in at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for the Ghost Army. Meanwhile, the actual invasion beaches at Normandy were being defended by just 8 divisions, most of them not nearly as strong. This imbalance was no accident. It was the direct payoff of Operation Bodyguard. They were defending with everything they had against an army of air and sound. And maybe the most mind-boggling part of all is how long the trick worked. For 7 full weeks, 7 weeks after the D-Day landings, Hitler kept his most powerful divisions waiting in Calais. He was utterly convinced Normandy was just a feint, and the real invasion was still coming. In a war, 7 weeks is an eternity. It gave the Allies the precious time they needed to secure their foothold in France and change the course of the war. But what about the guys who pulled it off? Well, after the war, the roster of this secret unit reads like a who's who of 20th century American art and design. You had Bill Blass, who'd go on to become a fashion icon, Ellsworth Kelly, a pioneer of minimalist art, Art Kane, who took some of the most famous photographs of his era. These creative minds went from designing camouflage to designing our culture. And yet, for most of their lives, nobody knew their story. The men of the Ghost Army were sworn to secrecy for half a century. The official story wasn't declassified until 1996. Think about that. Most of them went their whole lives unable to tell their own families about their incredible contribution to the war. It's only in the last few years that they've gotten the recognition they deserve, finally culminating with the Congressional Gold Medal in 2024. A long, long overdue honor. And that's why this story, this slice of history, feels more important now than ever. The Ghost Army used rubber, speakers, and clever radio tricks. Today, the tools are so much more sophisticated, right? We're talking about deepfakes, AI-generated propaganda, digital ghosts that are a million times more convincing than an inflatable tank. But the core principle is exactly the same, using deception to manipulate what people believe is real. The story of the Ghost Army is a warning. It forces us to ask a really tough question. If a few artists with rubber and sound could fool an entire military machine, what happens now when the battlefield is the internet and reality itself is the ultimate prize?